Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you for joining us after lunch. And as you have seen this morning, our UNESCO colleagues who are organizing the conference are very strict. So we have only 30 minutes for this fireside chat. And I will jump right in. And as we have heard this morning from many inspiring speakers, the challenges for online speech moderation, for democracies, for human rights, for sustainable development, and ultimately for peace are enormous. Equally, we've heard that expectations for finding adequate solutions are also very high. This event itself is part of the consultations to discuss, comment, and contribute to the guidelines for regulating digital platforms, but we will hear more than 70 speakers and hundreds of participants discuss the details of the guidelines this afternoon and tomorrow. Now we will take a bit of a step back and ask why UNESCO, why guidelines, what is the scope and approach, and how are the consultations conducted, and how will the document be used? So why, what, and how? I've just quoted our first speaker from his this morning's address. Dr. Tawfik Jelassi is Assistant Director General for Communication and Information at UNESCO since 2021. Dr. Jelassi is responsible for UNESCO's programs on fostering freedom of expression, leading digital transformation, ICT in education, and building inclusive knowledge societies. Assistant Director General and his teams are leading this consultative process. We also have Andrew Puddephatt, who is very well known to many of you, an internet policy expert who focuses on intersection of internet policy and human rights. He is the founding director of Global Partners at Associates, and he also chairs the Internet Watch Foundation and the International Media Support. Andrew is, of course, long-term senior consultant to UNESCO, who is given not at all an easy task to draft the guidelines that we are discussing over these 2 days. Let's first turn to Assistant Director General first. Tawfik, we heard from many comments and questions from colleagues about the rationale for UNESCO to take on this initiative. So how do you see UNESCO's role and mandate with regard to regulation of digital platforms? And was there a similar process undertaken by UNESCO that you have taken as a model or as a principle for doing this?
Thank you very much, Mira. Why UNESCO is doing this? If we go back to the mandate of UNESCO, that is some 77 years ago, the mission was to build peace in the minds of men and women. What has been happening lately through digital platforms does not contribute to peace building. I'm referring to message of hate, misinformation, disinformation, online harassment. All what has been happening is an attack to democracy, to freedom of expression, to human rights, and creates, at the end of the day, divisive societies, and therefore does not contribute to peace building. Number two, UNESCO mandate and mission is also to promote the free flow of ideas by word and image. Many decades ago, the outlets, the media companies, used words and image to promote content. Today, content is mainly promoted through digital means and the platforms. And therefore, we have also to contribute to promoting ideas through these new digitally enabled means. When we look around, so that's our context. I may add also, a couple of years ago, there was what we call the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration, which was the outcome of the UNESCO World Press Freedom Conference, in which it was clearly stated that information should be a common public good. Through the platforms today, we see information becoming a public hazard and a public harm. I can mention finally the work that UNESCO has done many years ago called the Internet Universality Indicators, based on 4 principles referred to as ROAM, R-O-A-M. R standing for a human rights-based approach to technology and the internet that should be open to all, accessible by all, and following a multi-stakeholder approach. So I just mentioned 4 reasons why UNESCO felt we should initiate a global dialogue, we should coordinate it through a truly inclusive multi-stakeholder approach. Of course, including our 193 member states, but also the technology companies that operate the platforms, the civil society organizations, NGOs, academia, research institutions, and the technical community. We didn't want to stay passive, watching the world passing by. We wanted to contribute and to bring in a humble way our brick to the construction of a trustworthy internet.
Thank you. And you can see that I'm trying to keep our speakers to time. We don't have much. So Andrew, just quickly, guidelines are taking human rights and freedom of expression approach. But you also, I quote, state that you're taking systems and process-based approach. And there are some decisions that you have made around the scope, and I'll single out only 3. One is around including harmful content as well as illegal content. But interestingly enough, account moderation is not mentioned. At the same time, business models and micro-targeting advertising as a base for that business model, competition and data protection are seen as beyond the scope of the document. And also guidelines include co-regulatory approach that can be interpreted by different stakeholders and community in different ways. What is your general approach to guidelines, and how did you make these decisions on what to include in the scope of guidelines?
So the general approach has been to say that the appropriate role for setting the goal for regulation belongs with the legislature after extensive multi-stakeholder consultation. Having established that, the guidelines go on to specify the specific human rights responsibilities of states in applying a regulatory framework. They then go on to set out the responsibilities of the companies in fulfilling that goal, with a particular emphasis on the company's systems and processes. So it's not a question of judging a company for any particular pieces of content. It's about judging whether they have systems and processes in place to do risk assessments, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, we look at the constitution and powers of an independent regulator who will oversee that system. Now, the reason we focused on content is, A, it's clearly within UNESCO's mandate. Both content and regulation are issues that UNESCO has been dealing with in the media world for many, many years. So it's clearly part of our mandate to do that. It is also the subject of the most legislative initiatives around the world. Over 40 countries, according to research by Chatham House and Global Partners, are actually introducing or have introduced content regulation. UNESCO is getting requests from member states for advice on content regulation. So we felt we had to respond to that by providing some guidance. And in relation to the wider issues around the underlying business model or advertising, actually the guidelines do relate to that. They do touch on that, but they touch on those issues insofar as they bear upon content. So they're there, but you have to understand that it's how they impact on content that we've chosen to look at in this first instance.
Thank you. Tawfik, back to you. You mentioned the multi-stakeholder approach, and the guidelines do mention in a couple of places open, transparent, multi-stakeholder, and evidence-based process. We have heard from some of the comments to the guidelines. I've read many, not the whole of them, that the consultation process was quite short and didn't give enough space for some of the communities that have less resources and capacity to contribute. What are your plans for this participatory process going forward? And I'm especially interested in any plans to support and empower participation of civil society, media, academic and technical communities in the countries that are just starting regulation and have less resources and capacity.
We heard that criticism. Some parties felt that we were rushing them through this open consultation process. It is for this same reason that we decided not to have an ending date for this effort. Initially, we had one. And many people in the room know that initially we did set a deadline to finalize and release the guidelines. Now we have removed that after hearing that comment. So we are now at draft 2 of the guidelines, which we have posted early February. And we told everybody you have until March the 8th to get back to us so we can produce the next draft based also on the inputs that we are gathering from this conference. The conference itself was designed to be an open consultation and contribute with content. And hopefully by the end of March, we'll release the 3rd draft of the guidelines for another iteration. So people can comment, can send inputs, and we'll see if by early summer, everybody is happy with the newer version. And here I should say, many stakeholders told us version 2 is a much improved content and guidelines than what we had in version 1. So why? Because we are incorporating, we are processing the more than 1,000 inputs that we received from all stakeholders. If we see by, let's say, end of June, early July, that everybody is happy with these global guidelines to regulate digital platforms, then we'll release them and we'll publish them. If that's not the case, we'll continue with the process and then we'll go into the fall. So again, this is truly inclusive, participatory, multi-stakeholder, and through thematic consultations, regional consultations, we have been having many working sessions with individual entities to say, if you have some substantive inputs, let's connect for half a day or for a few hours. Let's listen to the arguments behind your inputs. This is how we can make it acceptable and hopefully implementable by all parties concerned.
Thank you. Now we are going to you in the room, and as this is a multi-stakeholder meeting and a consultative process, we want to hear from you, and in other sessions we will hear from colleagues online. So the question that the organizers asked me to give you is, what recommendations do you have for the next stages of the consultation process and for the guidelines to become a tool that is useful? So please feel free to raise your hands if you are first from the public sector. Keep to 2 minutes, no, minute and a half, I was told, for this session, and introduce yourself before you speak. So I'm trying to see whether there are any questions from representatives of the public sector. Yes, I have a lady here in red in the first row.
Thank you. Dr. Ahlem Arfewi Tertir, United States. I am international human rights observer and expert in global diplomacy, certified from UNITAR. I am going to share with you one of my serious worries. We know today that the government and countries' leaders are a part of problems and one of main sources of fake news, lies, and false information on the social media. Today we suffer from political propaganda creators on social media that their role is to invent and share false information, lies, fake news, and hate speech in the goal to attack human rights activists, democracy defenders, and journalists, to scare them, to put stress on them, and to silence them. So my question will be, how the UNESCO will process with that, especially that we know, all of us, that UNESCO or the United Nations don't have any real power on the government and the country's leaders. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, do we have anyone from private sectors, from companies, or from industry representatives? I see a hand at the back of the room, the last row, the gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Fritz Israel. I'm with AGI Laboratory in the United States, a company that's developing next level AI. And if you're asking for recommendations as to what you should do, I think it's much easier for companies to consider implementing recommendations as they are developing rather than trying to fix something afterwards. And the second recommendation is to not only look at big tech companies, but remember that in the aviation industry, the Wright brothers beat everybody by being smart and by being small, and that sometimes the good things don't come from big companies that have big plans and big revenue expectations, but maybe sometimes small companies can do something more innovative and more generally acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Now, civil society and media. I'm sure there are many questions there, but let's try to take one at the back there in black. Yes, please, in the middle.
Hello, this is Alp Toker from NetBlock's Internet Observatory. One thing that we would like to see in civil society is an increased tie-in with the existing freedom of expression work that UNESCO has been doing, because we've found that it's sometimes somewhat distinct from existing initiatives, and I think it would really clarify things to tie it in. We also want to see an increased clarification about definitions of misinformation and disinformation, so that these new rules aren't misused by authoritarian regimes. We need to clarify exactly how these terms are defined.
Thank you. And the fourth group that is asked to comment and ask questions, academia and technical community. We have, I think, a lady here in the middle.
Thank you. Jessica Field from the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard in the United States. My question is whether you all have considered evaluating current content moderation legislation that is already either being enacted or in force under the guidelines as drafted. I think it would be very interesting and informative to look at, for example, the Online Harms Bill in the UK, or the Network Enforcement Act, or PAFMA, under these the guidelines to inform us more deeply about how they would work in force.
Thank you. And finally, we have the fifth group is intergovernmental organizations. Let's see. I saw some colleagues from intergovernmental organizations. Yes, are you from intergovernmental organization? I know we have, I'm sorry, I can't break the rules. Let me see. Can we have another question from civil society and media instead of the intergovernmental? Oh no, we have intergovernmental there, the gentleman in the white shirt.
No, I'm civil society, but we can have a go.
No, the lady was first here in the first row. Okay. Go ahead.
My question is about gender, and we know that March the 8th is the International Women's Day, and Dr. Jelassi just said that the second version by March the 8th will be ready. So my question is, what is the place for gender equality in the future guidelines? Thank you.
Thank you so much for these questions. Let's comment briefly before we go to the closing questions. Would you, Tawfik, like to go first and maybe respond to the first questions around the areas where different stakeholders are under attack, where UNESCO doesn't have powers, as we have heard, and maybe around gender, and then I'll go to Andrew around other questions.
Well, first of all, the question about UNESCO not having an executive power. Yes, UNESCO does not. Yes, UNESCO is not a regulator and cannot be a regulator. Other parties that have taken initiatives, like the European Commission, they have a regulatory body, and if the players don't respect whatever they come up with as a law, they can penalize, they can issue fines. That's not the case of UNESCO. Our role has always been advocacy, advising on policies, helping governments, member states to put in place the needed regulatory system nationally, and we hope these guidelines will inform and will guide member states who wish to do so in revising, in updating their national regulation. But we do not have the regulatory power that you refer to. So our objective is very clear from the outset. And finally, I would say on this point, I think member states realize, at least it's our conclusion, that the two dominant approaches to this matter are a laissez-faire approach that did not work, strict state regulation that did not work either. So what we have in town has been widely ineffective. And that's why we have been advocating not only co-regulation, private sector, public sector, but truly multi-stakeholder regulation. And here comes the issue of gender as well, because civil society, as Madam Hagerby said it, defends gender equality, etc. We are paying attention to that, and the current draft of the guidelines does capture that as well.
Thank you. Andrew.
I'll pick up the others, yeah.
Yes, we have a couple of questions, yes, and so you can go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, so on consultation with small companies, definitely, very welcome. Please consult the latest draft, and if you can, feed comments in, and we will try and outreach to organisations of small companies, because I think going through organisationally might be an easy way of tap into what's a colossally broad market. Whether, in terms of consistency with UNESCO's own policies on free expression, I worked with UNESCO for 20 years on free expression. I think it is fairly consistent. I think if there is a reference in the guidelines, I don't know if everybody's read them, to existing UNESCO initiatives which are relevant to this. If you think that should be strengthened, please say so. Whether we should define disinformation more closely is quite a hotly contested point. I think we're very keen to get submissions on the section dealing with content management. We think that the harms or potential problems online will shift and change. I mean, ChatGPT is coming in, wholly different set of problems to the ones we've identified before. And so we tended to take a risk-based approach to how companies should manage harm. And that may not require a very detailed discussion or definition of something that, by its nature, actually can be quite elusive. And on the Bertman question, it's a very good point. We have commissioned, UNESCO has commissioned a paper by Toby Mendel, an international law expert, on existing approaches to legislation. The Chatham House and Global Partners digital paper analysing the current initiatives in relation to content regulation should be available in June, and the lessons from those will be incorporated in the paper. What I could say now on the basis of what I've seen is that there are many differences between the existing legislative approaches being adopted by countries. That is manageable for the larger companies. It's very challenging for small companies if you come and suddenly face 80 different pieces, separate requirements from different countries as to how you should manage your business. So I think some consistency that the UNESCO guidelines can provide would be a big advantage to new entrants and small businesses as well as the broader public.
Thank you. And I was told we have only 3 more minutes to go. So Andrew, just quickly, what will happen after the guidelines are finished? And what do you see as purpose and use cases? And Tawfik, in a couple of sentences, just how will this initiative link to other UN processes?
So I think that the outcome, as Tawfik said, when we get to the end of the consultation process, will be a paper by the Secretariat, which is available for guidance and advice, not just to states considering legislation, but to regulators, to parliamentarians who wish to understand these issues, to civil society and to academics. So we see it as the contribution to a much broader, evolving debate in the international sphere. I would say, just a plea as someone who's going to have to incorporate your comments, that if you do make comments, please make them specific about specific points, and if you can, suggest potential wording. I've had a number of submissions that have gratifyingly explained how little I understand about the internet, human rights, regulation and the UN system, which is great for me to know, but it hasn't actually helped me in actually drafting the paper. So if you do have comments, try and be very specific and helpful, because that's the way we make progress, and you can see the drafts changing over time.
Tawfik, 3 sentences.
That's hard. Well, we all know that there are a number of initiatives being undertaken within the UN system. Many of us are aware we do contribute ourselves, UNESCO, to the Global Digital Compact, which is one of the key pillars of the UN Summit for the Future for September 2024. the common agenda call by the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres. This morning, Melissa Fleming mentioned the Code of Conduct for the Information Integrity Initiative, which is she's leading that. So we, of course, we are the one UN. We collaborate with each other, and we hope that these guidelines will feed into at least some of the initiatives I mentioned.
Thank you, and I had a couple of closing sentences, but we ran out of time. We'll declare this a new category in sessions and conferences, Sprint Fireside Chat, and I will ask you to commit to hold many more Ask Me Anything and Fireside Chat sessions going forward. Thank you.